Corrupt judge sentences a woman unfairly. Then she pulls out a CIA badge. A gray haze clung to the quiet city as dawn broke, and the scent of damp pavement lingered in the air. To anyone passing the grand, neoclassical courthouse, it seemed like an ordinary morning, public defenders rushing inside, harried plaintiffs double-checking documents, the occasional reporter waiting for a big headline. Yet beneath that calm lay countless stories of heartbreak and hope, desperation and determination, each tale shaped by the unknown complexities of the law and the human heart. Today, one of those stories was about to unfold, and it would set off a chain of events that no one in that hallowed hall could have predicted. Pushed open the heavy wooden doors with a trembling hand. The courthouse lobby, flanked by marble columns and polished floors, seemed at odds with her state of mind. Her heart pounded in her chest like a jackhammer. She wore a simple white blouse tucked into black slacks, trying to present herself as neatly as possible despite the clamor of unease gnawing at her gut. She was not an especially tall woman, but she carried herself with a quiet strength. That morning, however, something in her stride betrayed a hint of vulnerability, an uncertainty she rarely displayed. She paused in the entryway, scanning the crowd. Attorneys in suits clutched thick folders, security guards checked bags and briefcases, and overhead lights buzzed faintly. The building was both intimidating and orderly, a place where truth could be set free or caged by the smallest twist of fate. Took a breath, forcing herself to remain steady, forcing back the swirl of thoughts that threatened to overwhelm her. She had come here reluctantly, summoned to face a charge that had shaken her life to its core. And she still couldn't quite believe the man who had orchestrated this was the same person she had once trusted. As she made her way down the corridor, the echoes of her footsteps followed her like ominous whispers. Her head snapped up at the first mention of her name. A balding clerk holding a stack of papers looked around the hallway. His tone was neither kind nor hostile, merely procedural. She stepped forward and lifted a hand in acknowledgement. When he saw her, he dipped his head in a curt nod. "Courtroom 4B, third on the docket," he said. "Don't be late. Judge Pierce doesn't like delays." She murmured a thank you, though the name Judge Pierce forced her to clamp down on a tide of raw emotion. She had heard plenty about Pierce in the past few months. He was a figure of power in this county's legal machinery, charming at times, but rumored to be ruthless behind closed doors. There were whispers in hushed corners of the hallway that he had connections to shady dealings, that bribery and hidden favors lined his pockets. Tried to piece together any semblance of calm. She needed to stay level-headed, especially now. She had spent countless nights compiling evidence, emails, account statements, a litany of small leads that suggested the judge's corruption. But if that evidence was leaked at the wrong time, she could lose more than just a case. She could lose her entire future. Careful to avoid notice, she slipped into a quiet alcove near a water fountain. Her hand trembled slightly as she pressed her palm against a small bulge on the inside pocket of her blazer. It was the one secret she refused to relinquish, her final trump card that nobody here knew existed. Not yet. If she had to, she would lay it bare at the last minute. But she didn't want to, not unless everything else failed. Something in her gut told her that, given the judge's rumored network of corruption, letting that truth out too soon might invite more danger than she could handle on her own. She felt alone, weighed down by an entire system that seemed stacked against her. But underneath the swirling anxiety, there was a core of steel, something that had been forged over a lifetime of challenges. She wouldn't go quietly. A voice hissed near her shoulder, startling her from her thoughts. She turned sharply to see an older woman in a navy pantsuit. Her motherly face was lined with worry, but her eyes shone with fierce resolve. Rose Booker, a public defender known for her unwavering commitment to the underdog, reached out and gave Sarm a reassuring squeeze. "I'm so sorry I couldn't meet you before," Rose whispered. "I had a last-minute hearing this morning, but I'm here now. We'll go in together." A wave of relief cascaded through his chest, though she could still feel a nagging tension in her throat. Rose was the closest thing she had to an ally in this mess, a dedicated attorney who believed in her innocence. The woman's sharp mind and compassionate soul had been a lifesaver in the last few weeks, helping wade through endless legal jargon, court procedures, and ominous warnings from the prosecution. "Thank you," managed. I was feeling a bit isolated." Rose's features softened. "We're going to fight this, and we're going to win," she said, with a confidence that allowed to breathe a little more easily. The older woman steered gently by the elbow, guiding her down the hallway. They headed toward a pair of tall double doors that marked Courtroom 4B. A hush fell over as they entered, the solemn air of justice pressing down upon her like a weight. Inside, the room was split by a wooden barrier. Rows of benches sat behind it, where a few spectators had gathered. At the front, the judge's elevated bench loomed large, and the official seal behind it suggested finality and unshakable authority. That seat was still empty, but knew it wouldn't be for long. To the right sat a neatly dressed man with wire-rimmed glasses. The prosecutor, Justin Hale, was an up-and-coming star in the district attorney's office. He projected a calm confidence. Some might call it smugness. Word on the street was that he had personal ties to Judge Pierce. Whether it was golfing buddies, campaign donations, or something more insidious, had no doubt they'd move in tandem if it served their cause. As took her seat at the defense table, she sensed eyes boring into her. She didn't dare turn around to see if any journalists were present, if the curious gaze of the public was there. Instead, she let her eyes focus on the thick file in front of her, each page representing a piece of evidence the prosecution claimed implicated her in a crime she hadn't committed. Fraud, embezzlement. The words made her stomach clench every time she saw them on paper. She knew how damning these charges could be, how an ordinary life could be decimated by even a hint of financial wrongdoing. But this wasn't just some random set of accusations. There were deeper motives behind them, deeper truths she couldn't expose without risking her hidden life. Her hidden life. That thought made her reflexively brush her fingertips over the inside of her blazer once more. She closed her eyes, remembering the years she had devoted to her work, the countless nights she had spent in training or gathering intelligence, the near-impossible tasks she had fulfilled under pressure. The clandestine role she played in national security had turned her into a fortress of self-control. Yet here she was, feeling more vulnerable than she ever had in field operations. In the shadows, you expect betrayal and deceit. But in a public court, where truth and justice are supposedly paramount, it was more terrifying to realize you could be framed so easily. A hushed murmur rippled through the room. Opened her eyes to see Judge Pierce enter through a door adjacent to the bench. He was in his mid-50s, with slick-back gray hair and a trimmed salt-and-pepper beard. His robes swept the floor as he took his seat, giving him an air of imposing authority. Perhaps if she didn't know better, if she hadn't seen the evidence of his shady dealings, might have found him dignified. Instead, her entire being tensed at the sight of him. As he looked over the courtroom, she caught a flicker in his eyes when his gaze landed on her. It wasn't an alarm, rather a hint of satisfaction, like a hunter eyeing cornered prey. "Court is now in session," the bailiff announced, prompting everyone to stand. Judge Pierce gestured for them to be seated, and the formalities began. Words droned about case numbers, charges, and procedural details. Each time her name was spoken, felt a fresh stab of alarm. Still, she maintained a stoic front, working to keep her mind from unraveling. Across the aisle, the prosecution presented their opening statement. Hale spoke with carefully measured language, painting as a cunning manipulator who had used her professional position, a mid-level account manager at a financial firm, to funnel client funds into hidden accounts. Each word felt like a hammer blow. She fought the urge to cry out that she was being framed, that the documents were forged, that the real criminals were likely orchestrating this from the shadows. But revealing too many secrets too soon could jeopardize everything, including her own deeper mission. When it was Rose's turn, she stood up and drew in a long breath. Her voice, though calm, held a resolute tone as she refuted each allegation. She wove a narrative of a dedicated woman who had, in fact, noticed irregularities and attempted to address them, only to be silenced by powerful individuals in the firm. Rose hinted that the wrongdoing pointed higher up, that was a scapegoat. But something about the judge's cold expression and the prosecution's half-smile made stomach knot. It was like the outcome was already decided. Hours passed in a blur. Witnesses came forth. Some were old co-workers of uncomfortable and glancing away, as if they'd been coerced into testifying. One client recounted how they discovered discrepancies in their account statements. Another rattled off numbers, claiming was the only one who had access to certain files. Knew how the documents had likely been doctored, but she had no solid proof to show it was done by someone else. Not yet. The day's proceedings were a relentless march of half-truths and carefully spun accusations. By the time Judge Pierce recessed for the day, felt as though she'd been dragged across a battlefield. In the hallway, the weight of it all crashed down on her. "Rose, they're systematically closing every path I have to exonerate myself," she whispered hoarsely. "You saw those documents. You saw how methodically they've constructed this case. What if the truth doesn't matter?" Rose's face was etched with concern. "The truth does matter, but we have to make it matter in the eyes of the law," she said softly, steering away from a passing clerk. "Look, there are ways to fight. We might be able to challenge the authenticity of those documents, bring in forensic experts. We can push for a deeper investigation into the bank's own processes. It's going to be an uphill battle, though." Searched Rose's eyes. "I think there's more at stake here. I think there's a reason the judge is so comfortable letting the prosecution steamroll us." She swallowed, her voice almost a whisper. "He's tied to them, I'm certain. He stands to gain from a conviction." Rose placed a gentle hand on shoulder, her voice low. "Do you have proof?" "I've been gathering it," said, biting her lip. She wanted to confide in Rose fully, to reveal that her skill at uncovering these connections was no accident, that she had tools at her disposal far beyond what an ordinary civilian might have. But she held back. Even someone as trustworthy as Rose might balk if she learned the depths of true identity. "It's not enough to go public with yet," she hedged, "but I have strong leads." Rose nodded. "If you find anything concrete, bring it to me right away." She gave Sarm another squeeze. "We'll figure this out, but stay safe, understand? You're treading on powerful people's toes." That night returned to her modest one-bedroom apartment, exhaustion weighing down her limbs. The flickering street lamp outside cast pale patterns on her living room wall. She dropped her bag on the floor and kicked off her shoes, sinking onto the couch with a long exhale. Her eyes flicked to the small table in the corner, where an innocuous potted plant sat. Beneath that pot, hidden from casual view, was a locked metal box containing a crucial part of her life: her CIA credentials, along with some sealed folders detailing the preliminary intelligence she'd gathered on Judge Pierce's suspected ties to a money laundering ring. She had been operating under deep cover for months, investigating financial crimes with national security implications. The judge's name had cropped up repeatedly in classified reports. Her mission had been to uncover the truth and gather enough evidence to bring him down quietly. Yet she had underestimated him, or rather, the network that protected him. Instead of having the upper hand, she now stood accused in a public forum. The irony stung. She was supposed to be the one gathering evidence, not fending off these carefully planted accusations in open court. Still refused to crumble. She reached beneath the couch, pulling out a slim laptop. After powering it on, she typed in a complex series of passwords, ensuring the encryption was intact. A secure connection established itself, though even that might not be fully safe if the judge's associates were actively watching her. She scanned through the digital files, cross-referencing bank transactions, scanning real estate purchases, suspicious wire transfers all tied to Judge Pierce or shell companies rumored to be under his influence. A small glimmer of hope sparked. There were patterns. One of the shell corporations had recently funneled a significant amount of money to an account that bore a striking resemblance to those used in the black market arms trade. If she could prove Pierce was linked to it, the entire house of cards might collapse. Yet she hesitated. Going public or filing an official CIA report would blow her cover and compromise the mission. She closed her eyes, recalling her training, the quiet discipline instilled in her. She'd always known that these undercover tasks carried personal risk. But this felt different. It was messy, it was personal, and the clock was ticking. Tomorrow she would face another day in court. Watch the prosecution throw more twisted half-truths her way. Watch as Judge Pierce wore his black robes and pretended to administer justice. She shut the laptop with a grim determination. If she had to, she would reveal her true identity in court. But that would be her last resort. She'd rather dismantle his carefully, piece by piece, so that when the final blow struck, he and his network would have no chance to slither away. Sleep was elusive, haunted by fragments of the day's testimony and the chilling image of Judge Pierce's triumphant grin. When morning finally broke and her alarm blared, she left her apartment with a black coffee in hand, not feeling even the slightest bit rested. The streets were wet from a pre-dawn drizzle, the city slowly rousing itself to another round of daily business. Arrived at the courthouse early, determined to find an advantage before the proceedings began. Her attempt was futile. The day proceeded much like the previous one, tense, orchestrated. The prosecution took up large swaths of time with additional witnesses and endless document analysis. Hale made certain to keep the narrative laser-focused on supposed wrongdoing. Rose tried to interject every time the prosecution twisted facts, but the judge sustained almost every objection against the defense. His frustration mounted. It was as though the entire courtroom was rigged to steamroll her. She caught glimpses of a man in a dark suit near the back of the spectator seats. He had the hallmark signs of an operative or private investigator, eyes constantly scanning, posture rigid, ears subtly turned to pick up anything interesting. She couldn't be sure whom he was working for, but it heightened her sense that dangerous eyes were watching her every move. By midday, could barely keep her composure. Everything was stacked against her. Her heart lurched when she heard the prosecution mention a piece of fabricated correspondence allegedly showing her instructing her to hide illicit funds. Wanted to leap up and scream that she had never sent such an email. She looked to Rose, who was already on her feet, challenging the authenticity of the exhibit. But Judge Pierce waved off the concern with a dismissive gesture, refusing to strike the evidence from the record. Nails bit into her palm, and the sting of that pain grounded her. She had to stay calm. Finally, the judge called for a short recess and followed Rose into the corridor, tension practically radiating off her. Before she could speak, Rose held up a hand. "I know," she said. "He's swatting down every challenge we make. I can't remember the last time I faced such blatant bias from the bench. It's like he doesn't even care if it's obvious." Leaned in, her voice low. "He's growing bolder. Maybe he thinks his connections will protect him no matter what." Rose's gaze darted around to ensure they weren't being overheard. "We need something irrefutable to shake him up. Something that'll make him realize he can't just brush us aside." She hesitated before continuing. "I don't know if we have that yet." Swallowed a surge of conflicting emotions. "I might," she said carefully. "But if I show my hand too soon, everything could fall apart. I need to time it right." Rose studied her, a flicker of confusion in her expression. "I'm on your side. If there's something you're not telling me that could be used in court." "I can't explain fully," cut in, her voice tinged with urgency. "Just trust me. If I come forward with it, it'll change everything, but it's risky. Give me a little more time." She hated to leave Rose in the dark, but revealing her CIA role would also endanger Rose. The public defender was fearless in court, but she wasn't trained for the underworld of intelligence where real threats lurked. They parted ways for a few minutes. Rose needed to coordinate with a forensic analyst and headed to a small lounge near the side of the courthouse to gather her thoughts. She had to figure out a way to use her secrets strategically. Maybe she could slip some of the intel to an investigative journalist, have them break the story from another angle. The risk, though, was that Judge Pierce's allies might shut it down before it ever saw the light of day. Tension twisted in her gut. She replayed the moment, months ago, when her superior in the CIA had briefed her on the assignment. "We suspect a high-level official is using their influence to launder money for international arms smugglers. We need proof," he had said. They didn't yet know it was a judge, didn't know it would become this personal. She recalled the fierce pride and determination she'd felt back then, the unwavering commitment to do what was right. Now, in the thick of it, she wondered if she might lose everything. When the recess ended, walked back into the courtroom. But the next few hours only brought more disheartening revelations. The prosecution unveiled additional proof, which Rose struggled to dismiss. By the end of the day, Judge Pierce warned that the jury would likely be instructed soon, as the trial was nearing its conclusion. Could almost feel her world teetering on the brink of collapse. She didn't linger in the corridor this time. She left the courthouse swiftly, ignoring the glances of bystanders. The sun was setting, painting the sky with streaks of orange and pink. On the sidewalk outside, she paused, staring at the horizon and wondering if she had any chance left. Deep inside, a sliver of resolve still burned. She refused to let corruption triumph. Tomorrow, the judge might ask for final statements, might even be prepared to push for a swift guilty verdict. She realized with a jolt that she could not afford to wait any longer. That night, she prepared meticulously. Her next moves had to be precise. She contacted a trusted CIA handler through a coded message, requesting an urgent meeting. The location was set, a small diner on the edge of town, far from the courthouse's watchful eyes. At midnight, she drove down a nearly deserted road until she reached the diner, its neon sign flickering. Only a few trucks were parked outside. She slipped into a booth near the back, scanning the area. Moments later, a man wearing a worn jacket and a baseball cap took a seat across from her. He looked like a trucker who had stopped by for a late-night meal, but his posture was too measured, his gaze too sharp. This was her handler operating under the alias. They didn't acknowledge each other at first. The waitress drifted over, took their orders, a coffee for a hot tea for, and left. When the coast was clear, spoke quietly, keeping his eyes on the table. "I got your message. You said it was an emergency." Rick nodded, leaning in slightly. "I have the proof we need," she murmured, "but I'm cornered. The judge is about to sentence me on fabricated charges. If I don't act, I'll go away for a crime I didn't commit. The agency will disavow any knowledge of this mission if I'm convicted, and all the evidence I've gathered might be sealed or destroyed." Inhaled sharply, "You're certain Pierce is behind your framing?" "He's orchestrating it, or at least condoning it," said. "He has a network that's used to dealing with bigger players, arms dealers, organized criminals. I suspect he sees me as a threat. If I go down, it's one less loose end for him. But if I blow my cover in court, everything changes." His jaw tightened. "That's a last resort. You know how the agency feels about public exposure." Locked eyes with him. "If I don't, I'll be locked up. All the resources we've gathered will be lost. Pierce will keep funneling money into dangerous hands." She paused, letting her conviction resonate. "There's no way out if I keep my identity secret. I need official backup. If I can reveal what I am and produce the evidence, I might turn the tables on him. But I have to do it in a way that ensures maximum impact, so he can't just manipulate the system again." Rick looked away, rubbing a hand over his face. He was torn, clearly understanding the stakes. Finally, he sighed. "All right, I'll inform command. We'll see if we can get you an official green light. But the wheels of bureaucracy turn slowly, and you might not have time to wait." She felt a weight in her chest. "I have to decide tomorrow, most likely. The trial's almost over." Rick leaned forward, dropping his voice to the barest whisper. "Then trust your instincts. You've been trained for this. If you pull the badge out in court, you'd better have every duck in a row, documents, evidence, a plan to get the media's attention so Pierce can't bury the story." Rick nodded, a determined glint in her eye. I'll do whatever it takes." For a moment, she wondered if she should reveal to the mounting sense of dread that pressed on her. But instead, she let the conversation fade into final instructions, contact protocols, and a plan for immediate extraction if things went sideways. They parted ways soon after. His mind churned during the drive home. This was it, the final gambit in a high-stakes game she'd never meant to play in such a public way. She thought of Rose and how she would be. She thought of the jury, who had been fed one narrative for days. She thought of the relentless voice in her head that told her she had to stand up for the truth, no matter what it cost. And she thought of the moral lesson that seemed so painfully relevant. That power, unchecked and corrupted, can destroy innocent lives, but that courage, even from a single individual, can unravel the mightiest fortress of lies. The next morning, entered the courthouse with new resolve. There was a prickling sensation on the back of her neck, as though invisible eyes tracked her every move. Journalists were milling about in the lobby, sniffing for any sensational headline. She saw a woman with a notepad glance at her, but kept walking, her posture straight, her chin raised. This was the day it would all come to a head. Inside Courtroom 4B, the mood felt heavier, more charged. Rose was already there, reviewing her notes, face drawn with tension. Hale and his team were in quiet conversation, occasionally throwing smug glances in its direction. Judge Pierce was not yet on the bench, but his chair stood as a looming reminder of his power. Took her seat, inhaling slowly, trying to steady the tumult inside her. When the judge finally entered, he wasted no time. "We'll continue with closing statements," he intoned. The small group of spectators hushed. The gavel's sound echoed like a thunderclap in the tense silence. Hale presented his closing remarks first, hammering home the prosecution's case with an air of confidence. He spoke of damning evidence, alleged confessions, suspicious computer logs. He spun a web of guilt that, to an uninformed observer, seemed airtight. He made sure to mention the moral imperative of convicting criminals who manipulate financial systems for personal gain, even calling upon the jury to consider the public good. As he finished, he gave the faintest of smiles, like a predator who knew the kill was imminent. Next, Rose rose from her seat. She began calmly, highlighting the inconsistencies, the questionable authenticity of documents. She reminded the jury that had been an upstanding citizen with no prior record, that the whole scenario appeared carefully orchestrated. Her voice shook slightly, though, because she understood how heavily the scales were tipped. She pleaded with the jury not to let a flawed process condemn an innocent person. Still, every time she tried to mention that there could be deeper forces at play, Judge Pierce shot her a warning look or made a pointed remark. Clearly, he wanted no mention of corruption in his courtroom. Finally, Rose sat down, looking exhausted, squeezed her arm, trying to convey gratitude and the hint that something unexpected was about to happen. Rose, though confused, offered a faint nod. She trusted. Judge Pierce cleared his throat. "Before I instruct the jury," he said, "is there any further statement from the defense?" His gaze flicked to with cold disinterest. A hush spread across the courtroom. Stood up, nerves thrumming like a live wire through her body. She knew this was it, her last shot. She stepped forward, ignoring the faint tremor in her hands. "Yes, Your Honor," she said. "I'd like to make a final personal statement, if I may." He waved a dismissive hand, briefly, moved closer to the front of the courtroom, feeling the eyes of the jury, the prosecution, and the small audience on her. Her throat felt tight. She drew a shaky breath. "I stand before you accused of something I did not do. The evidence presented has been twisted in some cases. I've been painted as a criminal, all because I uncovered certain inconvenient truths about people in power." She paused, meeting the judge's eyes. A flicker of irritation crossed his face. Judge Pierce opened his mouth, presumably to silence her, but she spoke louder. "It is time the jury and the public know that the men who stand in judgment of me have ties to illegal activities, orchestrated behind a veneer of respectability. The one leading this charge is no paragon of justice." She locked eyes with him. She heard a murmur from the spectators, even a gasp. Hale rose angrily. "Objection, this is slanderous," but pressed on, talking over him. "And because of my investigations, I have become a target. If there was any doubt as to my qualifications or credibility, let me settle that now." Her hand dove into the inside pocket of her blazer. A ripple of tension swept the courtroom like a sudden gust of wind. She a slim leather case, flipping it open in one fluid motion. She held it high enough for the judge, the prosecutor, and the jury to see. The emblem gleamed under the lights, the letters CIA embossed in gold. For a moment it seemed the entire room forgot to breathe. Even Rose stared at in shock. The hush was deafening. Judge Pierce's expression turned thunderous, a mixture of disbelief and simmering rage. Justin Hale looked like he'd just had the rug yanked from beneath him. Continued, though her voice quivered with adrenaline. "My name is, and I am an undercover operative of the Central Intelligence Agency. I was assigned to investigate financial crimes and potential connections to international arms trafficking, connections that lead right back to individuals you see in this courtroom. The evidence against me has been fabricated to discredit me and ensure I can't blow the whistle." Chaos erupted. The judge pounded his gavel, shouting for order. The bailiff looked uncertain, glancing between the judge and his credentials. Murmurs grew in the gallery. Someone exclaimed, "Are you serious?" People rose from their seats. Hale tried to object, yelling about and security clearance. Meanwhile, Rose just stared at, momentarily frozen. She had never expected this. Turned to the bailiff, speaking in a voice that cut through the turmoil. "I have federal authority to present classified information in pursuit of justice," she said. "With your permission, I will demonstrate the connections implicating Judge Pierce in money laundering and complicity with organized crime." She pulled out a flash drive from her blazer. This drive contains unaltered documents that show where large sums of laundered money end up, accounts linked to the judge, among others. Judge Pierce's face was an image of barely contained fury. Spittle flecked at the corners of his mouth as he pointed the gavel at her. "This is an outrage. I will not allow this courtroom to become a circus." "On the contrary," said her voice cold, "this is the very purpose of a courtroom, to expose the truth, no matter how ugly. You are unfit to preside over this trial, and you know it." Hale tried to recover. "Objection, this is completely out of line. She can't just produce intelligence data without proper clearance or a chain of custody. This is irrelevant to the charges at hand." She's stalling. "I'm not stalling," snapped. "I'm doing my job. And a federal agent outranks your attempts at cover-up." She gestured to the bailiff once more. "I request that this drive be taken into protective custody immediately and examined by an independent forensic expert. It will corroborate my innocence and expose illegal activity conducted by the presiding judge. If the court refuses, I have colleagues in federal law enforcement who will gladly take it." At that, Judge Pierce shouted, "Enough." His voice cracked like a whip. He stood from his seat, robes swirling around him. The tension in the room was thick enough to cut with a knife. Several members of the jury looked confused, frightened even. The judge turned on them. "Dismiss the jury," he barked. "Now." A clerk hurried to usher the jurors out. They filed out in a state of dazed confusion, some glancing back at, others at the judge. The second the door closed behind them, Judge Pierce slammed his gavel onto the bench so hard that it cracked. "I will not have my reputation maligned by a self-proclaimed CIA operative. Bailiff, I want her arrested for contempt right now." The bailiff looked torn. Officially, Judge Pierce still had authority in the room, but the sight of the CIA badge and the mention of federal involvement had him hesitating. Meanwhile, Rose found her voice. "Your Honor, you can't arrest a federal agent simply because you don't like what she's revealing. If you're innocent, let the evidence speak for itself." Pierce glared, his face flush. "I refuse to dignify this nonsense. She's a fraud, seize her." Two uniformed officers approached hesitantly. She held her ground, lifting her chin. "If you do this, you risk obstructing a federal investigation," she warned. Her pulse thundered in her ears. She knew the next few seconds would decide everything. If the system was fully in the judge's pocket, she might leave in handcuffs. But if there was a shred of integrity left anywhere in that courthouse, they might pause. The bailiff held out a shaking hand, signaling the officers to stand down. The entire room was in chaos. People whispered furiously, and someone ran out, possibly to call for a higher authority. The tension was electric, both sides at a standoff. Judge Pierce, wild-eyed, seemed to realize that if he went too far, the spotlight would only intensify. He pointed at one last time. "We are adjourned until I've spoken with the head of this court district. Mark my words, Ms., or whoever you are, your game ends now." With that, he stormed off the bench, vanishing through the door behind it. Hale and the prosecution team gathered their papers in a flurry of panic. They threw hostile glares before following the judge out. Reporters who'd been in the audience scrambled to talk to witnesses and gather details. Camera lights flared in the corridor beyond. The entire courthouse had exploded into a frenzy of speculation. Rose approached, her eyes wide. "You're CIA." Her voice shook with both astonishment and a hint of betrayal that hadn't trusted her with this information before. Swallowed, forcing a calm expression. "Yes, I'm sorry I couldn't tell you. My mission has been to investigate financial corruption tied to an international network. Judge Pierce is part of it, or at least complicit in it. They set me up so they could silence me. I had no choice but to reveal myself." For a moment, Rose just stared, then her features softened. "Well, I guess that explains how you've managed to keep yourself so poised under pressure." A fleeting smile crossed her face. "I'm glad you chose to trust me enough to at least let me be part of the final reveal." Nodded relief battling the adrenaline coursing through her veins. "Thank you for standing by me. I'm sorry for you." Rose exhaled. "We're not out of this yet, are we?" "Not by a long shot," admitted, looking around. Already half a dozen reporters were trying to slip into the room, cameras rolling. But the important thing is that the truth is out there now. That's the one thing they can't fully control. In the hours that followed, the courthouse buzzed as the news spread like wildfire. A defendant in a high-profile financial trial had revealed she was a CIA agent, accusing the presiding judge of corruption. Lawyers and clerks whispered in corners, watchers from the press jammed the corridors, and the hum of speculation grew. Gave a concise statement to the local news cameras, carefully phrasing her words to avoid disclosing too many classified details, but enough to inflame public curiosity. She insisted that an independent forensic examination of her flash drive would vindicate her claims. She also placed calls to CIA contacts, demanding immediate support to secure the evidence and ensure her own safety. The next day, under an intense media spotlight, a higher court official ordered the trial to be suspended pending an internal review. Judge Pierce publicly dismissed the allegations, calling them outrageous fabrications. But behind the scenes, he was scrambling. Could sense it, her training allowed her to catch the subtle shifts of a cornered individual. He no longer had the same swagger, the same calm dominance. Now, a flicker of panic flashed in his eyes. He missed no opportunity to lash out verbally at anyone who dared doubt him. Yet leaks from law enforcement sources suggested that the evidence on flash drive was compelling enough to start a probe into the judge's finances. For Rose, the days after the reveal were a whirlwind. She found herself fielding calls from federal attorneys, local reporters, and even other judges curious about what she knew. To her credit, she remained steadfast by side, refusing to let her client's fate fall into limbo. She had gone from defending an accused felon to defending a CIA operative who'd exposed a scandal, and the transition was dizzying. But her unwavering sense of justice guided her. Meanwhile, braced for retaliation, she changed her routine, kept a low profile whenever possible. Late one night, as she walked down a dimly lit street near her apartment, her senses went on high alert. She was certain someone was following her, a dark shape lingering half a block behind. She took a winding route home, passing empty storefronts and silent alleyways. When she finally ducked into her building's stairwell, heart hammering, she wondered if it might be one of Pierce's hired men, or someone seeking hush money, or even just a spooked journalist. She'd grown used to the adrenaline of field operations, but being targeted in her own city felt terrifyingly personal. A few days later, it happened. She was returning from a meeting with a federal official who was analyzing her intelligence data. As she slipped into her car in the parking garage, a burly man in a black hoodie appeared in the mirror. Before she could react, he yanked the passenger door open, brandishing a gun. "Don't make a sound," he hissed, sliding in next to her. His mind raced. There was no easy way out. Her training kicked in, telling her to remain calm, look for an opening. "What do you want?" She managed, voice steady despite her racing pulse. He pressed the muzzle of the gun against her ribs. "Stop talking and start the engine. We're going for a ride." Panic coursed through her. She knew how these scenarios typically ended. But she also knew she couldn't let him control the situation. 1 second, 2 seconds, she counted quietly, her eyes scanning the surroundings. Then, in a lightning-fast move, she jammed her elbow upward, hitting his arm. The gun twisted away from her body, firing once into the windshield with a deafening blast. Shards of glass scattered. The man snarled, fighting to regain control. Twisted in her seat, using the hand-to-hand skills she'd been taught. She managed to land a solid blow to his jaw, stunning him briefly. However, he was large and determined. He backhanded her, sending a burst of pain through her head. Her ears rang, but she refused to give in. Struggling, she caught his wrist with both hands, forcing the gun down. He was stronger than she expected. The muzzle angled dangerously close to her leg. She let out a grunt, summoning every ounce of training and adrenaline. With one fierce strike, she slammed her knee into his side, distracting him just enough to snatch at the gun barrel. A second shot rang out, ricocheting off the frame of the driver's seat. The flash burned her vision, but she forced her advantage, twisting until she wrenched the weapon free from his grasp. He swore viciously, trying to snatch it back. She squeezed the trigger twice, the shots roaring in the enclosed space. The man fell back, clutching his shoulder, blood staining his hoodie. He let out an agonized yell, struggling to scramble away. Kicked the door open, leaped out, then whipped around with the gun aimed at him. "Stay down," she commanded, chest heaving. Through the echo of the shots, the rush of adrenaline, she heard footsteps and urgent shouts. People in the garage were running over. Doors slammed open. Sirens wailed in the distance. It felt like the entire moment was drenched in a surreal haze. By the time police arrived, the man was incapacitated and stood there, shaking, holding the gun. The officers approached with caution. She showed them her CIA badge, explained what had happened. They took statements, called for an ambulance. The wounded assailant glared at through pale, pain-laced eyes. He refused to speak, but she suspected he was connected to Pierce or one of the judge's criminal affiliates. His mission had likely been to abduct or kill her to silence the scandal. She stared down at him, a swirl of conflicting emotions raging within: fear, anger, relief, and an unwavering determination to see justice served. Within days, the media had a new headline: CIA agent survives brazen kidnapping attempt tied to ongoing corruption probe. Public sympathy swayed toward, and the relentless scrutiny on Judge Pierce intensified. Under heavy pressure, the county's Chief Justice moved Pierce off the bench until the investigation concluded. Then, in a dramatic twist, more emerged, possibly emboldened by his courage, claiming they had evidence of Pierce's illicit deals. One man who'd worked as the judge's clerk stepped forward with records of under-the-table payments. Another official confessed to forging court documents under Pierce's orders. The dominoes were falling. Amid the mounting scandal, the district attorney's office reevaluated the original charges against. Publicly, they stated that, in light of new evidence, the charges may have been based on fraudulent or manipulated data. Hale, the prosecutor, faced a professional firestorm, with many accusing him of collusion or at best willful ignorance. He resigned under a cloud of suspicion, awaiting his own inquiry. On the day was officially cleared, reporters mobbed her on the courthouse steps. She wore a simple jacket and slacks, her expression collected. Rose stood beside her, beaming. Cameras flashed and microphones thrust forward, capturing her every word. "I'm thankful that truth prevailed," she said, speaking calmly. "There was an attempt to abuse the legal system for personal gain, which nearly cost me my freedom and my life. This isn't just about me, though. It's about everyone who's ever been railroaded by corruption. I hope this case encourages more oversight and a renewed commitment to real justice." The moral lesson resonated, that we must remain vigilant, even within institutions built upon honorable ideals, because corruption can take root where power goes unchecked. And also that one person, armed with determination and truth, can expose the rot, even at great personal risk. The court building behind her no longer felt like a monolith of despair. It seemed, at least for that moment, to stand for something better, redeemed by the clarion call of honesty. As for Judge Pierce, he faced an onslaught of charges: money laundering, racketeering, conspiracy. He made bail, loudly proclaiming his innocence, but his fall from grace was swift. Public support evaporated, and his name became synonymous with betrayal of public trust. By the time the investigation concluded, the evidence was overwhelming. There were bank records linking Pierce to organized crime, sworn testimonies of intimidation, and even digital footprints of fraudulent transactions. The same unyielding system he had once manipulated now turned its scrutiny upon him, the final irony of his corruption. 1 week after her exoneration, found herself standing on the quiet steps of a different government building. She was waiting to meet with a senior agency official. She gazed out at the city skyline, lost in thought. In exposing her identity, she had sacrificed her deep cover status. She knew her work would never be the same. There might be a new assignment or a new role, but it wouldn't involve the anonymity she had relied on before. Still, she felt no regret. If the cost of preserving her secret life meant allowing injustice to stand, she couldn't have lived with herself. Rose arrived a few minutes later, carrying a small gift bag in her hand. She smiled sheepishly. "I know it's not much, but I wanted to give you something to celebrate your freedom and the fact that we actually won." His lips twitched into a warm smile. She opened the bag to find a simple notebook inside, its cover embossed with the words "Truth Prevails." She ran her fingertips over the letters. "Thank you," she whispered, touched by the gesture. "I don't know what to say." Rose stepped closer, a gentle hand on shoulder. "Just promise me you'll keep fighting for that truth wherever you go. This system has flaws, but it can still be redeemed by people who care enough to challenge it." Clasped the notebook to her chest. "I promise," she said softly, a sense of closure washing over her. She glanced up at the building behind them, reflecting on the journey that had brought her here. The terror of the trial, the threat against her life, the adrenaline rush of revealing her CIA badge, it all felt like a vivid blur. Yet from that chaos, a sense of renewal emerged. She had stood her ground against corruption, refused to be silenced, and found allies in unexpected places. In a quiet moment of reflection, she allowed herself to remember the fear and humiliation she'd felt when Judge Pierce first pronounced that ominous sentence over her, how hopeless she'd felt facing a barrage of lies. She recalled the dread of walking into court each day, her name smeared by false accusations. Then she recalled that singular rush of empowerment when she'd lifted her CIA credentials for all to see, forcing everyone to confront a truth that could no longer be dismissed. There, in that raw moment of revelation, she had taken back her agency and her dignity. The moral reverberation of her story lingered. Power without accountability corrupts deeply, but even the mightiest stronghold of deceit can crumble under the weight of a determined individual armed with truth. For that would forever be her guiding principle. She would carry on, whether as an active agent or in another capacity, championing the belief that justice, while fragile, could be revived by bravery and integrity. Stepping away from Rose, turned her eyes to the horizon, letting the breeze brush across her cheeks. The road ahead was uncertain, her cover was blown, her future missions in question, but she felt a growing lightness in her heart. She had faced the darkness within the very system meant to uphold the law, and she had not faltered. She had used every ounce of her training, her resolve, and her faith in what was right to pull off a victory that many had deemed impossible. And for that she was grateful, grateful to be alive, grateful to have proven that the soul of justice still beat beneath the surface, waiting for those who dared to fight. In that moment, as she stood there with the setting sun casting a golden glow over the city's rooftops, she closed her eyes and let a quiet gratitude fill her. She was free. She was vindicated. And maybe, just maybe, the world was a little more just because she had refused to surrender. When she opened her eyes, a faint but resolute smile curved her lips, and she walked away from the courthouse steps, notebook tucked under her arm, ready to face whatever new challenges lay ahead.